when the screen wouldn't turn away. Dean Martin had learned, over decades in Hollywood, how to shut things out. He had learned how to smile when he didn't feel like smiling, how to laugh when the laughter was expected, how to raise a glass and play the part even when his heart was somewhere else entirely. He had learned how to let applause roll over him like harmless rain. But on the night of September 7th, 1975, lying alone in his dark Beverly Hills bedroom while the city slept, he discovered there were still some things a man could not train himself to ignore. Sleep wouldn't come, the house was too quiet, the kind of quiet that made old memories louder. The clock on the far wall glowed faintly, 2:13 in the morning. Dean sat up against the headboard, remote control heavy in his hand, flipping channels without seeing them. Late movies, paid programming, static, news reruns, nothing held, nothing mattered. Until suddenly it did. The screen changed and Dean froze. The lighting was harsh, the sound uneven. A banner stretched across the bottom of the television, MDA Labor Day telethon, phones ringing, volunteers moving. And in the center of it all stood a man Dean had not heard speak his name in 19 years. Jerry Lewis. Dean didn't reach for the remote. He didn't lean back. He didn't even breathe properly. He simply stared, the way a man stares when something long buried suddenly begins to move. Jerry was thinner than Dean remembered. His famous energy was gone, replaced by something raw and burning. His suit hung loose on his frame. His hair was damp with sweat. His eyes were hollow with exhaustion. 70 hours into the broadcast, the announcer had said, 70 hours awake, 70 hours pleading, 70 hours standing between sick children and a world that rarely wanted to look at them. Jerry's voice cracked as he spoke, not the comic crack, not the practiced break. This was something else, something stripped, something human. Dean felt his jaw tighten. He had avoided this telethon for years, not out of cruelty, not out of indifference, out of survival. Because anything that pulled Jerry Lewis back into his life also pulled everything else with him. The laughter, the fights, the stages, the endless noise, the impossible closeness. The way two men could become something bigger than either of them alone and then shatter under its weight. But now Jerry was there, not as a comedian, not as a star, but as a man kneeling beside a wheelchair. The camera moved closer. A small boy sat in the chair, 6 years old, his legs thin, his hands curled. His smile brave in the way only children's smiles are brave. Jerry knelt so he could be eye-to-eye with him. "This is Timmy," Jerry said, and his voice failed on the name. He tried again. "He's 6 years old, and without a cure—" His mouth opened, then closed. He swallowed. "Without a cure, he won't see his 10th birthday." The words landed in the room like falling glass. Dean felt something tear open in his chest. The camera cut to Jerry's face, and there was no performance left. Tears tracked openly down his cheeks. His lips trembled. His hands, usually so precise, were shaking. "This isn't fair," Jerry whispered, not to the camera, not to the audience, but to the world itself. "These kids didn't do anything wrong. They deserve more time than this. They deserve better than this." Behind him, phones rang. Volunteers worked. Money moved. But in front of the camera, a man was breaking. Dean turned the volume down, but he did not turn the television off. He watched Jerry rest his forehead briefly against the child's head. Watched him take a breath that didn't seem to fill his lungs. Watched him straighten, knowing millions were watching, knowing he had to continue, knowing there were still hours to go. Dean's hands had curled into fists. 19 years. 19 years since he and Jerry had stood in a dressing room at the Copacabana, sweat still cooling on their skin, the roar of the crowd still echoing faintly through the walls, and said goodbye to something neither of them understood how to live without. The world believed it had been about money. The world believed it had been about ego. The world believed two stars had simply grown too bright to share the same sky. But sitting alone in the dark, watching Jerry Lewis struggle to hold himself together on live television, Dean Martin knew the truth was heavier than that, and sadder, and far more complicated. They had not broken because they hated each other. They had broken because they loved each other and did not know how to survive it. From 1946 to 1956, they had been everywhere. Nightclubs, radios, movies, television, Dean's smooth voice, Jerry's chaotic genius. Calm and storm, control and explosion. Together they had been unstoppable. They worked when others slept. They rehearsed when others rested. They moved from stage to set to studio with barely enough time to breathe in between. Jerry lived on momentum. He needed movement, noise, new ideas, more hours. Dean lived on rhythm. He needed pauses, silence, space. Jerry chased perfection. Dean chased peace. At first, they balanced each other. Then they began to suffocate each other. By 1956, the laughter hid exhaustion. The jokes covered resentment. The affection masked strain. They were brothers who could no longer share the same room without feeling the walls close in. The final show ended. The applause roared. The curtain fell. And in a quiet dressing room, away from microphones and lights, they stood facing each other like two men at the edge of something neither had words for. "If you ever need me," Dean had said quietly, his voice stripped of charm, stripped of performance. "Doesn't matter when, doesn't matter why, you call." Jerry had nodded. He couldn't speak. They shook hands. They walked in opposite directions. And neither ever called. Now, nearly 2 decades later, Dean sat in his bedroom watching Jerry Lewis beg strangers to help dying children while his own body visibly failed him. When the segment ended, Dean finally reached forward and turned the television off. The screen went black, but the image did not leave. He sat there in the darkness, hearing only the distant hum of Lowe's angels beyond the windows, and something he had carefully sealed for 19 years began to press against its walls. At 9:30 the next morning, Dean Martin called his business manager. "I need Jerry Lewis's home number." There was a pause on the line, not technical, human. "Dean, are you sure?" "Yes." Another pause, then paper moving, keys clicking. 2 hours later, a number was written on a small white card in Dean's hand. He stood in his study, staring at it as though it might speak first. The room was filled with the evidence of a full life. Gold records on the wall, framed photographs, awards, smiling faces captured in moments that looked easier than they had been. None of it helped. He sat, he stood, he walked to the window, he walked back. 19 years condensed into 10 digits. He picked up the phone, put it down, picked it up again. Then, before he could change his mind, he dialed. 1 ringed. 2, 3, 4. He nearly hung up. "Lewis residence." A woman's voice, calm, professional, protective. "This is Dean Martin," he said. His voice did not shake, but something inside him did. "Is Jerry available?" There was another pause. "Mr. Martin, Jerry just finished the telethon this morning. He's been awake almost 3 days. He's sleeping." "I understand." Dean closed his eyes. "When he wakes up, tell him I called. Tell him I watched part of the telethon. Tell him I want to help with the charity. If he wants to talk, he can call me back." "I'll tell him." The line went dead. Dean stood there holding the receiver long after the sound faded. He had opened the door. He did not know if anyone would walk through it. 6 hours later, the phone rang. Dean answered before the second ring. "Hello." For a moment, there was only breathing. Then a voice, rough, worn, unmistakable. "Dino." Dean closed his eyes. "Yeah, Jer, it's me." Silence stretched between them, not empty, but crowded with everything they had never said. "You watched it?" Jerry finally asked. "Some of it." Another breath. "I looked pretty bad, huh?" "You looked like hell." Jerry let out a weak, tired laugh. "That good?" "Yeah. I feel worse." "How much did you raise?" 16 million. Dean whistled softly. "It's not enough," Jerry said. "It's never enough. The kids keep coming. The disease doesn't care how hard we work." Dean leaned against the desk, the weight of the moment settling into his bones. "What if I told you I could find you another million?" There was a sharp inhale on the other end. "Dean, how?" "I know people who owe me favors, people who have more money than they know what to do with." He paused. "But I have one condition." Jerry's voice was quieter now. "What?" "You have to take care of yourself. You can't keep doing this like you're trying to die on camera." There was a long silence. Then Jerry said, barely audible, "Why do you care?" Dean did not hesitate. "Because despite everything, you're still my partner." The sound Jerry made then was not a laugh. It was not a word. It was something breaking. "I missed you," Jerry said into the phone. "I missed you every day." Dean's throat tightened. "I know, me too." And somewhere in a city that had built entire careers on illusion, something real began to move again. The things no one sees. After that first phone call, Dean Martin did not sit and wait for the world to change. He had spent too many years in show business to believe in miracles that arrived on their own. If something was going to be done, it had to be built quietly, patiently, and without spectacle. Within an hour of hanging up the phone, he had already begun writing names on a yellow legal pad. Old studio heads. Casino owners in Las Vegas who still owed him favors from nights when he had filled their rooms without asking for a percentage. Hotel magnates, shipping heirs, men who had inherited more money than they could ever spend, and women who funded hospitals and museums simply because they could. He knew who they were. He knew how to speak to them. He also knew that asking for money was not about numbers. It was about stories. And this time, the story was not about him. He began with people who trusted him, not business first, but friendship. He called one man he had once sung for at a private anniversary dinner, a man who now owned half the hotels on the Strip. He told him about watching Jerry on television at 2 in the morning. He told him about a 6-year-old boy in a wheelchair. He told him about 70 hours without sleep and a man who still stood there because children were dying. He did not dramatize. He did not beg. He simply told the truth. When the man asked how much was needed, Dean said, "As much as you can give without feeling it." The check arrived the next morning. Then he called another, a shipping executive who had once confided after too much scotch that he had lost a daughter to illness when she was 9. Dean did not mention Jerry at first. He spoke about children who measure their lives in birthdays they might not reach. There was silence on the line, then a long exhale. "Where do I send it?" the man asked. Dean gave him the address. He moved down the list, one name at a time, never repeating the same words, never using the same approach twice, because people were not doors to be knocked on, they were worlds to be entered. Some needed facts. Some needed emotion. Some needed to feel useful. Some needed to feel forgiven. Dean understood that better than most. He had spent a lifetime watching men give standing ovations in public and struggle to be decent in private. Within 3 days, the first million was already forming, checks promised, transfers scheduled, meetings arranged. He kept careful notes, not for recognition, not for accounting, but because he intended to deliver something to Jerry that could not be taken lightly. This was not a gesture. This was not a reunion stunt. This was a reinforcement of something that had never actually disappeared. Between calls, Dean found himself thinking about things he had not allowed himself to think about in years. Dressing rooms that smelled of sweat and powder. Hotel corridors at 3 in the morning with Jerry still talking, still inventing, still pushing ideas into the air as though sleep were a waste of time. Arguments that started over jokes and ended over philosophies of life. Jerry believing that if they were not squeezing every possible moment for output, they were failing. Dean believing that if they never stopped to breathe, they were losing the very reason people listened to them at all. Neither had been wrong, and neither had known how to live inside the other's truth. On the 4th night, Jerry called again. His voice was stronger, but the exhaustion was still there, woven into every word. They did not talk about the past, not yet. They spoke about research labs, about experimental therapies, about the long, slow grind of progress that never looked heroic on television. Jerry explained which projects were close to breakthroughs and which were desperate long shots. Dean listened like a man who had finally been given instructions after years of guessing. When they hung up, Dean adjusted his list. The million became 1.2. Dean arranged for the funds to be delivered quietly. No press, no announcements, just numbers moving where they were needed. When Jerry received confirmation, he did not cheer. He did not celebrate. He simply went silent, and Dean could hear the way gratitude sometimes sounds when it is too heavy for words. But the million was only the visible part, the part that history would eventually touch. What history did not know, and would not know for years, was that this was not the beginning of Dean Martin helping Jerry Lewis. It was simply the first time it had a voice. Because long before that night in 1975, long before the phone call, long before the telethon had ever forced itself into Dean's dark bedroom, something else had been happening quietly, methodically, and without a single witness who could connect it to him. It had started in 1956. Not weeks after the breakup, not months, days. 3 days after their final performance, Dean sat in his accountant's office in Beverly Hills while sunlight filtered through thin blinds and dust floated in slow motion like something suspended between decisions. Murray Wolfe had worked for Dean for years. He was discreet, exact, and unfazed by the kind of numbers that made other men behave foolishly. Dean had placed a single piece of paper on his desk. Muscular Dystrophy Association, Murray read. Donation. Yes, Dean said. Murray waited. I want to set up an annual contribution, 50,000. Murray's eyebrows lifted slightly, not at the amount, but at the tone. Public or private? Anonymous. Dean, Murray said carefully, a gift of that size. I don't want my name on it, Dean interrupted. I don't want a plaque, I don't want a letter, I don't want Jerry to know. Murray leaned back. Why? Dean had looked at the wall behind him. Gold records, framed movie stills. The evidence of a man whose name already appeared on more things than he could remember earning. Because it matters to him, Dean said, and because not everything needs an audience. Murray studied him for a long moment. Every year. Yes. For how long? Dean had not answered immediately. He had thought about Jerry's face when he talked about sick children, about the way he took that work personally, as though each child were a debt he could never finish paying. He had thought about how partnerships did not end just because stages did. For as long as I can, Dean had said. So every year after that, quietly, without interruption, without ceremony, without recognition, $50,000 left Dean Martin's accounts and entered the world of research and treatment under no name at all. Murray handled it through layered transfers and neutral accounting firms. No return addresses, no notes, no explanations. Dean never asked for updates. He never requested acknowledgement. He simply made sure it happened, like a man checking that a light somewhere remained on. When Jerry's telethon began years later, Dean did not tune in. He did not watch. He did not congratulate. He did not call. But every year when the checks went out, he knew where they were going and why. Now in 1975, for the first time, those two worlds were touching. A week after the $1.2 million had been secured, Dean visited Murray's office again. Murray had already prepared the documents. He knew what this meant. So, Murray said, folding his hands, this year's contribution will be separate. Yes, Dean said, the $1 million is public through the donors, but ours stays the same. Murray nodded. Then after a pause, he asked the question he had carried for 19 years. Dean, may I ask something? You've waited this long, might as well. Why did you never stop? Dean looked at him. Because every year Jerry stood in front of sick kids and told them he wouldn't quit, Dean said. And I wasn't about to make him a liar. Murray exhaled slowly. He still doesn't know. No. Doesn't that ever bother you? Dean shook his head. If he knew, it would become about us, and this was never supposed to be about us. Murray nodded, but there was something in his expression that suggested he understood the cost of that kind of silence. Not heroic, not poetic, just heavy. 2 weeks later, Frank Sinatra hosted a charity dinner at the Beverly Hilton. It was supposed to be a fundraiser. It became something else entirely. Frank had lived long enough and lost enough to recognize unfinished business when he saw it. He had watched Dean and Jerry pretend indifference in public for nearly 2 decades. He had heard what neither of them said. And when he learned that both men would be in the city that night, he decided to stop waiting for time to do what it rarely did on its own. Dean arrived early. He always did. He was talking with Sammy Davis Jr., laughing about something neither would remember clearly in the morning when the room shifted in a way that had nothing to do with sound. Dean turned without knowing why. Jerry had just entered. For a moment, the entire history of American entertainment reduced itself to 2 men standing still. Jerry looked older, not just in age but in accumulation, in the way purpose carves lines deeper than years. Dean felt the instinctive pull of familiarity and the equally strong resistance of everything they had never repaired. Neither moved. Then Frank appeared as though summoned by the tension itself. He placed one hand on Dean's shoulder, one on Jerry's, his grip firm, his smile unnegotiable. Enough, Frank said. You two have been miserable in parallel for 19 years. I'm done watching it. Frank, Dean started. No, Frank cut him off. There's a room in the back. Go use it. Talk like grown men or sit in silence. I don't care. But you're not spending another night pretending the other doesn't exist. And before either could object, he guided them toward the hallway. The door closed behind them. They stood there, separated by a few feet of carpet and nearly 2 decades of avoidance. in a room that smelled faintly of coffee and polished wood. Jerry spoke first. "You look good, Dino." Dean exhaled a short laugh. "You look like hell, Jur." Jerry smiled weakly. "Fair." They both sat, almost at the same time, as if standing had suddenly become too difficult. "Thank you," Jerry said finally. "For the money, it's going to change things." Dean nodded. "That's the idea." A silence formed, not hostile, careful. "Do you remember what you said to me at the Copa?" Jerry asked. Dean looked up. "I said if you ever needed me to call." Jerry swallowed. "I should have." Dean's voice was low. "So should I." Something shifted then. Not dramatically, not like in movies, just the slow realignment of something that had been tilted for too long. They talked about exhaustion, about regret, about the strange loneliness of success when the person who understood its weight was no longer beside you. They did not argue, they did not defend. They simply told the truth. And somewhere in the middle of it, without either man announcing it, a door that had been closed for 19 years unlocked. But the biggest truth still waited in silence. And it would not stay silent much longer. The secret comes into the light. The reconciliation between Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis did not happen in a flash of cameras or a staged moment of nostalgia. It unfolded the way real repair almost always does, quietly and without witnesses, through phone calls that stretched late into the night, through lunches that were never announced, through conversations that wandered between memories and confessions without any clear map. They did not try to become what they had once been. They tried instead to understand who they had become. Jerry spoke about the way purpose had overtaken his life, how the telethon had gone from something he did to something he was, how the children, the hospitals, the endless fundraising had filled a space he hadn't known how to name when Dean had walked away. Dean spoke about the strange emptiness of success, when there was no one left who truly remembered the beginning, about the way applause could fill rooms and still leave a man alone with himself when the doors closed. They laughed sometimes, the old rhythm flickering back in moments, but more often they sat in something quieter, something truer, something that did not need to perform. 3 months after that night at the Beverly Hilton, the Muscular Dystrophy Association held its annual board meeting in a conference room that smelled of coffee and fresh paper, far removed from the spectacle of the telethon stage. There were no cameras there, no audiences, only spreadsheets, projections, and the steady language of people who lived inside numbers because numbers meant treatments, and treatments meant time. Jerry sat at the long table, jacket off, sleeves rolled up, listening as the financial director reviewed the year's donations. Large gifts were mentioned, corporate pledges, foundation grants. Then the director hesitated slightly, the way people do when they reach the line item that never quite fits. "There is," he said, adjusting his glasses, "a donor we've never been able to identify." Jerry looked up. "This individual," the director continued, "has given exactly $50,000 every year since 1956. The donations arrive through layered accounts, always on schedule, always without a name, always refusing acknowledgement. Over 19 years, the total is just under $1 million. For a moment, no one spoke. Jerry felt something tighten in his chest. 19 years. The number settled heavily. It was not just the amount, it was the consistency, the patience, the decision to remain unseen. "Have we ever tried to trace it?" Jerry asked. "We have," the director said. "Repeatedly. The early donations were processed through a Beverly Hills accounting firm, but beyond that, the trail disappears." Jerry nodded slowly, his mind already moving. He did not need a full trail. He only needed a beginning. After the meeting, he did not go back to his office. He walked instead down the corridor, past doors that held years of effort until he reached a phone. He dialed a number he now knew well. Dean answered on the second ring. "It was you," Jerry said without preface. Dean did not pretend not to understand. "Yeah." "For 19 years," Jerry said, his voice unsteady. "You've been doing this for 19 years." "Yes." There was a silence, but it was not empty. It was crowded with everything Jerry had never seen. "Why didn't you tell me?" Jerry asked. "Because you would have thanked me," Dean said, "and I didn't do it for that." "Then why?" Jerry pressed. "Because the kids needed help," Dean said simply. "And because something you cared about that much deserved support, whether we were talking or not." Jerry closed his eyes. The weight of it pressed down on him, not like guilt, but like revelation. All those years he had stood under hot lights begging strangers to care, believing that one of the most important people in his life had walked away from everything he believed in. All those years the money had come, quietly, faithfully, invisibly, carrying a message he had never heard. "I thought you didn't care," Jerry said, his voice breaking. "I thought you left and never looked back." "I looked back every day," Dean said. "I just didn't announce it." Tears slid down Jerry's face. He did not bother to wipe them away. "Do you have any idea how many kids are alive because of that money?" he asked. "How many treatments, how many programs, how many families it supported?" "They're alive because of you," Dean said. "You're the one who built this." "You helped build it," Jerry said. "Every year, while I was angry, while I was stubborn, while I told myself you didn't care." "I didn't need you to know," Dean said. "I needed the checks to clear." Jerry let out something between a laugh and a sob. "You're unbelievable." "No," Dean replied softly. "I was your partner." 2 months later, the telethon returned. Jerry had not told anyone what he had learned. He did not announce it. He did not thank Dean publicly. He carried it the way men carry things that feel too large for applause. He did not even know if Dean planned to appear. He had not asked. And Dean had not offered. On the second night of the broadcast, with phones ringing and the familiar controlled chaos moving across the stage, Jerry was speaking about new research initiatives when he felt the room change. Not in volume, in awareness. The way a crowd sometimes becomes something like a single body responding to a presence it cannot yet name. He turned. Dean Martin was walking onto the stage. There had been no introduction, no build-up, no announcement. He wore a simple dark suit, not the showman's armor, but something closer to the way he dressed when he wanted to disappear into himself. He walked calmly, not toward center stage, but toward the phones. Jerry froze. For a fraction of a second, he forgot the cameras, he forgot the script, he forgot the donors, he forgot the years. He saw only his partner. Dean picked up a phone. "Hello," he said into it. "Yes, this is Dean Martin. I'm calling to take your pledge." Jerry covered his mouth. His shoulders began to shake. The audience did not yet understand what they were seeing, but they could feel it. The phones surged. The donation board began to climb. Dean worked the phones the way he had once worked stages, with ease, with warmth, with that unmistakable steadiness that made people feel safe in his presence. He spoke to strangers like men he had known his whole life. He thanked them. He listened to their stories. He told them why their help mattered. Jerry tried to continue. He could not. He turned away, overcome, then back again, and when he finally spoke, his voice was not that of a host, but of a man who had been given back something he did not believe he was allowed to have anymore. They worked side by side for 4 hours. By the end of the night, they had raised more than $2 million. But the money was not what people remembered. They remembered the way Jerry kept glancing at Dean, as though checking that he was still real. They remembered the way Dean leaned in when Jerry faltered, not to save the broadcast, but to steady the man. They remembered the way laughter slipped back between them without effort, like a language the body had never forgotten. After the broadcast, away from lights and applause, Jerry pulled Dean aside. "You know what the best part of this is?" he asked. "What's that?" "We get to be partners again," Jerry said. "Not on stage, but where it actually matters." Dean smiled. "We never stopped." Years passed. Dean continued to appear at the telethon, always without announcement, always without spectacle, always going straight to the phones. He never made speeches. He never positioned himself as part of a reunion narrative. He simply showed up and worked. Jerry continued his relentless push, but he no longer did it alone. There were moments between calls when they would sit together and watch the donation numbers climb, and Jerry would shake his head slightly, as though still adjusting to the idea that something lost had not, in fact, been destroyed, only rearranged. When Jerry Lewis died decades later, his son went through his personal files. He found folders no one else had been allowed to open. Inside them were calculations, handwritten notes, old financial records, copies of correspondence with accountants, attempts to track the mysterious donor who had supported the association from the beginning. Page after page of careful effort. At the bottom of the last page, in Jerry's unmistakable handwriting, there were only 4 words. It was always Dino. At Dean Martin's funeral, Jerry stood before a church full of people who believed they understood the man they were there to honor. He told them about the phone call in 1975. He told them about the checks. He told them about the 19 years of silent support. And then he said something that stayed with those who heard it long after the service ended. "People think Dean was cool because nothing bothered him," Jerry said. "That's wrong. Dean was cool because he cared so deeply he had to pretend he didn't just to survive it. I watched him carry things he never let the world see. I watched him help people who never knew it was him. And I know this, every anonymous check was him telling me, 'I'm still here, keep going.' And I did." The story of Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis is often told as a tragedy of ego, of a partnership destroyed by ambition, of two men who could not share the same light. But the real story is quieter. It is about a man who kept supporting his partner's mission long after they stopped speaking, about loyalty that did not need credit, about love that did not need an audience, about a partnership that did not end when the curtain fell, but simply moved somewhere the cameras could not follow. Dean Martin was not cool because he didn't care. He was cool because he cared enough to help in silence. And sometimes, that is the most powerful kind of love there is. The kindness that outlives applause. In the years that followed their reunion, something subtle but profound happened to Dean Martin. The man the public saw did not change. He still moved with the same relaxed ease, still smiled with the same half-amused calm, still spoke with the same gentle humor that made people feel as though nothing in the world truly troubled him. But beneath that familiar surface, the center of his life quietly shifted. The success, the awards, the appearances, the endless invitations to perform no longer held the same gravity they once had. He still honored them, still showed professionalism, still delivered excellence, but his real commitments were now elsewhere. They were in late-night conversations with Jerry about research programs, in reading medical updates he barely understood but cared about deeply, in listening to stories about children he would never meet but whose futures he had decided mattered. Whenever Dean appeared at the telethon, it was never framed as nostalgia. He refused to turn their history into entertainment. He declined interviews that tried to drag their reconciliation into headlines. He asked that his presence be treated as ordinary, almost unremarkable, and yet every time he stepped onto that stage, the room felt different. Volunteers straightened. Phones rang faster. Donors stayed on the line longer. It was not celebrity that moved them. It was the visible reality of a man who did not have to be there and chose to be anyway. Jerry noticed it more than anyone. There were moments when Dean would finish a call, set the phone down, and glance across the table to see Jerry watching him with an expression that was not gratitude, not admiration, but something closer to peace. They were no longer the young men who had once conquered America together. Their conversations were slower now, more reflective. They spoke about time in ways they never had before, about the way it carries things away without asking permission, about the way it sometimes, unexpectedly, brings things back. Jerry admitted that for years after the breakup, he had carried a quiet anger that he could never fully justify but never fully release. Dean admitted that he had confused calm with distance and distance with strength. Neither man tried to rewrite the past. They spoke about it the way men do when they finally understand that the past does not need to be defeated to be set down. When Dean's health began to falter in the early 1990s, he did not announce it. He did not dramatize it. He simply reduced his schedule, declined invitations, and retreated gently into the life he had always valued but rarely allowed himself to fully inhabit. Jerry knew before most people did. He began calling more often, sometimes not to discuss projects or fundraising, but to tell Dean small things, meaningless things, things that only mattered because they were shared. Stories about volunteers who had surprised him, about children who had learned to walk again, about a mother who had written a letter after a decade to say thank you. Dean listened, sometimes with humor, sometimes with long silences that were not empty. When Dean Martin died in 1995, the news traveled quickly, but grief does not move at the speed of headlines. Jerry did not rush to microphones. He did not give statements. He went instead to a quiet room in his home, sat down, and allowed himself to feel the full weight of something he had once believed he would carry forever, and then believed he had lost. At the funeral, when Jerry finally stood to speak, the church was filled with people who had loved Dean Martin for his voice, his presence, his charm, his work. Jerry did not talk about any of that. He spoke about phone calls in the middle of the night, about envelopes that had arrived without names, about a man who had found ways to care without controlling, to help without standing in front of it, to love without announcing it. People think Dean was unshakable, Jerry said, his voice quiet but steady. But I watched him carry things that would have crushed louder men. He didn't wear his heart on his sleeve. He built a house around it and lived carefully inside. And when he cared about something, he didn't make it a show. He made it a responsibility. Jerry told them about the anonymous donations, about the 19 years, about the way every check had been a conversation that never demanded a reply. He told them about the night Dean had walked unannounced onto the telethon stage, picked up a phone, and simply gone to work. He saved my life more times than I can count, Jerry said. Not because I was dying, but because I was tired, and he kept reminding me that what I was doing mattered, even when he thought I might never speak to him again. Years later, when Jerry himself passed, his son found the papers, the calculations, the attempts to trace the mystery donor, the notes made over decades by a man who could not let go of a kindness he could not explain. At the bottom of the final page were the words Jerry had written when he finally understood what had been standing behind him all those years. It was always Dino. When the full story finally emerged, long after both men were gone, it did not shock people because of the money. It shocked them because of the restraint. Because in an industry built on recognition, Dean Martin had chosen obscurity. In a culture that rewards declarations, he had practiced quietness. In a world that measures generosity by what can be seen, he had built a generosity that functioned entirely in the dark. He never gave because he was asked. He gave because it mattered. He never supported the cause because it repaired his image. He supported it because it was part of the man he had once loved like a brother. The story of Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis is often framed as a cautionary tale about ambition and ego, but the deeper truth is something else entirely. It is about the way human bonds can change shape without disappearing, about how loyalty does not always survive as closeness, but can survive as commitment, about how love does not always look like presence, but sometimes like persistence. Dean Martin did not spend 19 years waiting to be forgiven. He spent 19 years making sure children he would never meet had a chance to grow older. He spent 19 years proving that partnership is not measured by stages shared, but by burdens carried. And when history finally uncovered what he had done, it revealed something far more powerful than a reunion. It revealed a man who understood that the highest form of kindness is the kind that does not require witnesses. That is not just generosity. That is character. And that is why the real legacy of Dean Martin is not found in recordings, or films, or photographs frozen in time. It is found in lives that continued, because someone chose to help without needing to be seen. And sometimes, that is the most meaningful applause a person can ever earn. The quiet echo that never faded. Long after the stages were dismantled, long after the cameras were shut down, long after the applause that had once followed Dean Martin everywhere finally went silent, the influence of his choices continued moving through the world in ways no audience could chart. It moved through research centers where doctors worked late into the night, chasing solutions that did not carry celebrity names but carried hope. It moved through hospital corridors where children learned to stand, to breathe easier, to imagine futures their diagnoses had once tried to steal from them. It moved through families who never knew why a particular program existed, only that it did, and that it had arrived just in time. None of them knew Dean Martin. None of them needed to. The impact of what he had done had outgrown the identity of who he was. In the years after Dean's death, Jerry Lewis found himself thinking less about the stages they had once shared, and more about the small, unrecorded moments he had nearly lost forever. He remembered a night during one telethon when Dean had stayed long after the broadcast ended, not to talk about numbers or press or public reaction, but to sit quietly with a volunteer whose daughter had just been diagnosed. Jerry had been across the room when he noticed Dean kneeling to hear the woman speak, his head bowed, his posture not that of a star but of a man offering his full attention. There had been no cameras, no staff nearby, no reason for anyone to perform, and yet Dean had stayed there for nearly 40 minutes, listening, nodding, occasionally placing a hand gently over the woman's as she tried to find words for a fear too large to organize. At the time, Jerry had barely registered it. Years later, that memory returned often, not as an image, but as a realization, that this was who Dean had always been when the world was not watching. Jerry also began to notice something else. At every telethon, people would tell him stories about anonymous help they had received, a struggling clinic that had suddenly been funded, a family whose medical bills had quietly disappeared, a program that had survived another year when it statistically should not have. Jerry never claimed credit for these things. He simply listened. But each story carried the same emotional texture he had come to recognize, the sense of help arriving without explanation. The feeling of being supported without being observed. It was as though Dean's way of caring had quietly taught others how to do the same. And Jerry began to understand that generosity, when practiced without spectacle, does not end with a single act. It replicates. When Jerry spoke publicly about Dean in later years, he rarely used the words people expected. He did not emphasize fame. He did not emphasize success. He emphasized reliability. He told people that the most powerful thing about Dean Martin was not his voice or his presence, but the way he could be counted on when no one was keeping score. He said that Dean had been the kind of man who understood something very few people ever truly grasp. That character is not what you show the world when it is paying attention, but what you allow yourself to be when there is no reward for it. Jerry often reflected on how close he had come to misunderstanding his entire life. For nearly 2 decades, he had told himself a story about abandonment. He had filled the silence between himself and Dean with assumptions that grew heavier the longer they went unchallenged. He had believed that partnership ended the day 2 men walked out of a dressing room and did not look back. What he had learned too late was that partnership can survive in forms that do not resemble themselves. That loyalty can function without conversation. That love can operate without proximity. And that sometimes the deepest support is the kind that never announces its presence. The discovery of the anonymous donations had changed Jerry, but not in the way people might imagine. It did not make him proud. It made him careful about the stories he told himself about other people, careful about the way he interpreted silence, careful about assuming he understood what lived behind another man's distance. He began speaking often to younger entertainers about this, not about fame, not about contracts, but about relationships. About the danger of letting time become a substitute for communication. About how easily pride disguises itself as independence. And about how many connections are lost not because they are broken, but because they are never reached for again. The story of Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis slowly took on a life of its own, but not in the headlines. It lived instead in classrooms where students of performance discussed partnership not as branding, but as responsibility. It lived in nonprofit circles where people spoke about anonymous giving not as strategy, but as philosophy. It lived in the private decisions of individuals who, having heard the full truth, began asking themselves a question that did not appear in any script. Who am I helping when no one knows my name? What made the story endure was not its celebrity. It was its contradiction. Dean Martin, one of the most recognized men of his era, had built one of the most meaningful parts of his life around being unrecognized. He had chosen, again and again, to operate in a space where applause could not reach him. And in doing so, he had created a legacy that did not fade when his voice did. Years after Jerry's passing, when journalists and historians pieced together the full scope of what had happened, they often described it as a secret finally revealed. But those who truly understood it knew that it had never been a secret. It had been a decision, a choice repeated every year, a commitment renewed without witnesses, a philosophy practiced so consistently it became invisible. The real power of the story lies not in what Dean Martin did, but in how he did it. He did not rescue. He did not position himself as essential. He supported. He stabilized. He strengthened something outside himself and allowed it to stand on its own. He gave without shaping the narrative. He helped without becoming the center. He remained loyal without requiring access. In a world that teaches people to document every kindness, to display every act, to transform generosity into identity, Dean's life offers something quietly radical. It suggests that the truest form of impact is the one that survives without your presence, that the deepest form of loyalty is the one that does not depend on being seen, and that love, at its strongest, is not loud. It is steady. It shows up year after year. It moves resources where they are needed. It listens when no one is listening back. It keeps promises that were never written down. The partnership between Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis did not end in 1956. It went underground. It shed its stage and its spotlight and its laughter and became something less entertaining and far more enduring. It became a system of support, a channel of care, a quiet engine that powered a mission larger than either man. And that is why when people say Dean Martin was cool, the word feels inadequate. Because coolness fades. But character doesn't. And the kindness he practiced in silence continues to echo in lives he never met, in futures he never saw, in victories he never claimed. That is not celebrity. That is legacy. And that is the kind of story that does not end when the curtain falls. It begins. What remains when no one is watching? As time moved forward and the world that had once been shaped by nightclubs, studio lots, and live broadcasts slowly transformed into something faster and more fragmented, the story of Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis did not fade. It softened. It traveled. It changed hands. It began appearing not in entertainment columns, but in conversations between teachers and students, between doctors and donors, between parents and children trying to explain why helping someone matters even when there is no applause attached to it. What endured was not the celebrity. It was the pattern. A man who could have demanded recognition chose instead to become infrastructure. A man who could have walked away chose instead to remain quietly present. And in that choice, he revealed something most people never see because it rarely announces itself: the architecture of real goodness. There is a temptation in every generation to believe that impact must be loud, that if something truly matters, it must leave visible proof: numbers, screens, headlines. But the deeper truth, the one Dean lived without ever turning into a slogan, is that the most important structures in human life are almost always hidden. Foundations are buried, nerves run beneath skin, roots hold forests without appearing in photographs. Dean Martin's anonymous giving functioned in the same way. It was not designed to impress. It was designed to support. It existed so that something else could stand, and because of that, it did not weaken when attention moved away. It strengthened. People who later studied the early funding patterns of muscular dystrophy research noticed something unusual. During periods when public donations dipped, when attention shifted elsewhere, when campaigns struggled to maintain momentum, there was an uninterrupted line of support that never wavered. It did not grow. It did not shrink. It simply continued. That consistency allowed planning. It allowed stability. It allowed long-term commitments in a field where uncertainty usually governs every decision. Long before breakthroughs could be celebrated, there had to be endurance. And endurance had been quietly purchased year by year by someone who did not attach his name to the work. This is what separates kindness from contribution. Kindness responds. Contribution sustains. Kindness can be spontaneous. Contribution is chosen again and again. Dean Martin's real gift was not money. It was reliability, and reliability changes systems. It allows people to build rather than scramble, to research rather than plead, to think in decades instead of seasons. Jerry Lewis, who lived inside the chaos of fundraising and the urgency of need, understood this better than anyone. He knew that while emotional moments fueled action, stability allowed progress. And stability had been standing behind him long before reconciliation ever gave it a face. In the later years of his life, Jerry spoke less about show business and more about stewardship. He told younger entertainers that success creates a question whether you want to hear it or not. The question is not what you will do next, but what you will hold, what causes you will protect, what responsibilities you will accept that no contract requires. He said that Dean had taught him something no stage ever had. That partnership does not end when proximity does. That loyalty does not require agreement. That support does not need permission. And that sometimes, the most profound way to remain connected to someone is to protect what they believe in when they are no longer there to see it. The world often celebrates transformation, but rarely persistence. It admires visible sacrifice, but overlooks the quiet discipline of showing up when enthusiasm has expired. Dean Martin's 19 years of anonymous giving were not fueled by emotion. They were fueled by a decision made once and honored without applause. And because of that, they carried a power that no dramatic gesture ever could. They built a continuity that survived misunderstanding. They preserved a bond that had lost its language. They ensured that even at the height of their separation, Jerry Lewis was never truly standing alone. What makes this story timeless is not that it happened. It is that it can be repeated, not in scale, not in celebrity, but in structure. Anyone can become infrastructure for something that matters. Anyone can choose to support rather than signal. Anyone can decide that what they value will not depend on visibility. That is the invitation hidden inside the life Dean lived. It does not ask for admiration, it asks for imitation. There are people in every viewer's life who are carrying something heavy without broadcasting it. causes that survive on the edge of sustainability, individuals who have chosen work that gives more than it returns, relationships that were never properly finished, dreams that still exist even though the conversation ended. The story of Dean and Jerry suggests that none of these are as distant as they appear. That support does not always require re-entry. That reconciliation does not always begin with words. Sometimes it begins with consistency, with choosing to protect something because it once mattered to someone who mattered to you. Dean Martin never reclaimed his partnership through a tour. He reclaimed it through responsibility, through making sure the work Jerry had dedicated his life to would not collapse simply because they no longer shared a stage. And when they finally did speak again, what they found was not a past they could restore, but a present that had quietly survived. That is what remains when no one is watching. Not the performance, not the reputation, but the systems we sustain, the people we quietly keep standing, the promises we honor even when no one reminds us they exist. Long after voices fade, recordings age, and images lose their power to impress, what continues is what was built without decoration. The scholarships, the programs, the research, the lives that unfold because someone chose endurance over display. Dean Martin is remembered as a singer, an actor, an icon. But he lived privately as something else. A man who understood that love does not require proximity, that loyalty does not require acknowledgement, and that the deepest form of impact is not what follows your name. It is what continues when your name is no longer there. And that is not only the end of this story. It is its beginning.